Right, good morning, grade 11s. So, we're going to continue with our theme of nationalism. Up until now, we've been focusing a lot on nationalism that is destructive or that today we view in a negative light. But obviously, when we're talking about the decolonization of Africa, the process where Africa achieved its independence through nationalist movements, we're looking at perhaps a more positive form of nationalism, i.e., people who think and talk and have the same religion that is the same, them banding together and overthrowing the yoke of the colonial oppressors. So I've included two videos for you to watch over today and tomorrow. The first one is just a map on how decolonization happened, and then the second one is just talking about decolonization in Africa, the process. Okay, so we're going to be looking at one country in particular. It was referred to as the Gold Coast there. I think the name speaks for itself. Today it is known as Ghana. I think those of you who like football will probably know them quite well because they're one of the stronger football nations in Africa and have done quite well in the World Cup. I think they were referred to as the Black Stars. But we're going to look at Ghana for a number of reasons. The main one was it was one of the very first countries in 1957 to decolonize, to gain independence. Okay, so this is a timeline. This is not in your book. I'm not going to discuss it. I just thought it was a nice thing for you to have. It's not going to make a lot of sense now, and the detail that it goes into, you certainly don't have to know for exams, but it's a nice something to refer to if you need it. Okay, so until shortly after World War II, I think World War II changed the mindset of the colonial powers. And it also, many African states fought in the war and understood the idea of protecting your nation or country, i.e. nationalism. And when they came home from war, they wanted to implement what they'd learnt in their own countries. So until the 1950s and 60s, nearly all of Africa was still under colonial rule. And the Gold Coast was, of course, a British colony in West Africa. A lot of West Africa, of course, was French, but the Gold Coast, Africa, belonged to Britain, excuse me. It was the first colony in sub-Saharan Africa to achieve its independence in 1957 under a leader by the name of Kwame Nkrumah, and we're going to talk about him more now. Interesting cartoonist. This is actually a Soviet cartoon, and it's called The Sweep Out, and it's showing a very powerful African man representing African nations, or Ghana in this case, and it's called The Sweep Out. It's making changes and throwing all of these colonialists into the sea. So Russia wanted to extend her influence in Africa. The only difference was Russia or the Soviet Union didn't want to colonize Africa. But let's be clear, their intent was also to establish very strong ties here and to use Africa in the whole Cold War that was going on at this time. Okay. So we've spoken already in detail about Pan-Africanism, which you understood to be the ideals that all Africans should be united. Some Pan-Africanists believe all Africans should be united in Africa. Others believe that it could be anywhere. And it's started amongst the people of the Caribbean and North America. Marcus Garvey, who we've discussed already, he was from the Caribbean. They were descendants of slaves taken forcibly to Africa during the slave trade, and they obviously suffered tremendous racism and discrimination both in the Caribbean and North America, excuse me. Pan-Africanism was partly a cultural movement, the idea that people of Africa need to focus on their cultural heritage. They need to take pride in the fact that they are African, and they must look at their common heritage and culture. So it was a political movement, but it was also a cultural and even an economic movement. Some of the early Pan-Africanists whose ideas influenced the people in the African diaspora. We came across this. Diaspora means to spread out. People were spread out, but not by their own choosing, thanks to slavery and African people being exported to all sorts of countries. And there are three people we're going to touch on very briefly. W.E. Du Bois, as they say, but I think it should be Du Bois, but in America they talk about Du Bois. He was an intellectual, so he wasn't really a political activist, who wrote many books on black history and culture and called for better conditions for people in the African colonies. He organized a series of Pan-Africanist conferences where Africans in the diaspora and from Africa could meet and exchange ideas. Now, understand this was a very radical thinking at the time, that Africans could actually manage their own African affairs and that they could come together in order to achieve this. The second one, we've discussed him before, Marcus Garvey. He was from the Caribbean, from Jamaica to be precise. He was an inspiring leader, a great orator, and had millions of followers. His idea was of black pride and black consciousness, and his most famous saying, Africa for the Africans, the belief that Africa should be for Africans only. We discussed that when we looked at African nationalism in South Africa. And then a guy we haven't come across, also from the Caribbean, a guy by the name of George Padmore. He was a leading trade unionist and communist who thought it was important to liberate the working class. So although he was very certainly political, his concern was more about the economy, that Africa can't really be free unless the working class have a say. So the working class was suffering doubly in Africa. Number one, they were exploited, as the working class was at that time, but also because of their color, they were seen as inferior. So that was his whole thing. He had a strong influence on many African leaders. This is source B. Under Marcus Garvey's leadership, the Universal Negro Improvement Association had about 2 million members across 40 countries. The UNIA started the Black Star Steamship Line. The shipping company encouraged trade between black entrepreneurs in America and the Caribbean and Africa. It also gave African Americans a means to return to Africa, which they were encouraged to do. So have you bought your shares in the Black Star Line? If not, please do so today. And then various ways of encouraging people to do so, either to invest in the company or to return to their roots to Africa. In 1945, a Pan-Africanist conference was held in Manchester in England. It set the tone for a lot of the nationalist movements that would follow. It demanded an end to colonialism and called for a union of independent African states. That never really happened, but today we do have the African Union, so I suppose in some form it did eventually. It called on workers, intellectuals and peasants to unite and fight to achieve the goal of African nationalism, and it promoted strikes, boycotts and other forms of force to gain independence. So we're going to see a lot of violence, a lot of protest, a lot of opposition to colonial rule occurring. And people like Kwame Nkrumah from the Gold Coast, he was educated overseas, as many of the liberation struggle heroes were. And he was keen to bring about political change, not only in the Gold Coast or Ghana, but in the rest of Africa as well. Okay, you're going to be today and tomorrow be doing something on source C and D, so I'm going to spend some time on it. The historian Edem Kojo and David Chanawa discussed the significance of the Manchester Conference. Okay, the tone of discussions, and especially the resolutions that were passed, were considerably more militant and radical than those of past congresses. I think by this stage people were getting annoyed and upset that nothing was happening, and so they naturally became more demanding, aggressive and militant. The delegates also demanded for Africa freedom from foreign imperialist control, whether political or economic. More importantly, for the first time, Africans clearly warned that if Europeans still intended to rule Africa by force, Africans would use force in their effort to attain freedom. So they were threatening force pretty much for the first time. Simultaneously, the delegates made another declaration to the African peoples, which emphasized that the struggle for political independence was only the first stage and the means towards complete economic, cultural, and psychological emancipation. You understand, from slavery, emancipation is becoming free. They called upon the urban and rural masses and intellectuals and professionals to unite and to fight for independence. By the end of the Fifth Congress, Pan-Africanism finally had been turned into a mass ideology of Africa. It was being accepted throughout the world, and the whole idea of Africa for the Africans was starting to really take root. It had grown from a reformist protest ideology for the peoples of African descent in the New World into a nationalist ideology for the continental liberation of Africa. Remember, at this stage, something like 96-97% of Africa in the 1940s was still colonized or were still colonies. The global Pan-Africanism of Du Bois, the military self-determination and self-reliance of Garvey, had then become integral elements of African nationalism. Several of the delegates, such as Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta, soon left London for Africa to lead their peoples to independence and to establish new constitutions. And then down here, source D, from the principles and resolutions passed by the Pan-African Congress that we referred to there, this statement showed how African nationalist intellectuals were starting to see the importance of workers in the struggle for liberation. I think if you look at the history of decolonization, you'll see a strong communist flavor, partly because of the Soviet Union and their influence, but partly in the belief that workers also needed to be liberated, as did African people politically. So here is the quote: "We believe in the right of all peoples to govern themselves. We call on all workers and farmers of the colonies, to organize effectively. Colonial workers must be in the front of the battle against colonial rule. Your weapons, the strike and the boycott, cannot be defeated." So this was obviously a far more radical approach and was symbolic of the changing attitude in the post-World War. And you can imagine countries like Britain and France that were decimated due to World War II and struggling to recover were starting to question whether this sort of opposition whether it was worth it. And that perhaps explains why it happened so quickly. Right, the roots of nationalism in the Gold Coast, even before the ideas of Pan-Africanism, the educated elite in African colonies were clamoring for freedom. We know, for example, in South Africa that the ANC, established in 1912, was an intellectual, elitist, non-violent organization then. The Gold Coast had one of the best colonial education systems with high literacy rates, and institutions such as Chimoto College outside of Accra. A new generation of black Africans learned Western concepts such as democracy and nationalism. It's quite ironic, of course, that the schools, at least in part established by the British colonists, would educate people to throw off the yoke of British colonialism. They became increasingly critical at these schools of colonial rule, and then with the printing of publications such as the African Morning Post in Accra, it started to spread more and more. Increasing, these nationalists began to give socialist interpretations to the idea of nationalism, socialist and communist. They said that once independence was gained, they would want to bring in a whole new system. The system would be socialist and would, in their view, address the economic problems that the Gold Coast was having, and trade unions would form a big part in that, which is, of course, a very socialist in its design. The economy of the Gold Coast was based on cocoa. It was their major export, sold mainly to British companies, which set the prices they paid them. So it wasn't free market economy. During the Depression, cocoa prices dropped to a half. People obviously couldn't afford chocolate during a depression, and cocoa farmers resisted by holding back production to force companies to pay higher prices for their cocoa crop. A nationwide strike by cocoa farmers, large British companies such as Cadbury and Fry resisted these moves and refused to pay higher prices. They also started buying up farms and forcing smaller scale local farmers out of business. In 1937, local cocoa farms went on strike, refusing to send supplies, and they were supported by the dock and transport workers who refused to load cocoa. So the whole thing broke down. The strike called for an end to company controls and demanded fair prices for their produce. They were influenced by the socialist ideas in Europe that were now taking root in countries like France and Germany. But the strike also became a nationalist movement against British political control, and it lasted for 8 months. That's a hang of a long time for a strike to last. And eventually the government set minimum prices for cocoa farmers, and so in a way I suppose the strike was successful. We are almost there. These farmers are pictured at work in the cocoa fields on the Gold Coast, obviously before the strike happened. So the socialist emphasis in the thinking of some intellectuals is reflected in this extract by George Pudmore. He comments on the importance of new forms of worker protest. This comes from his article, Cocoa War on the Gold Coast, published in The Crisis, a socialist magazine produced in the United Kingdom. And I see for some strange reason I've left it out. My apologies there. If you could just go read it on page 161 right at the bottom, but I'll read it out now aloud. For the first time in the history of Africa, 3 million people have taken up the challenge against vested interest and have applied the economic strike weapon. This is symptomatic of the new Africa, which is gradually becoming conscious of its strength. Right, and then your work that must be completed, please, by Tuesday afternoon or evening. There are 6 questions here based on your book. So you must read page 158 to 162. You can obviously consult the Jamboard again. The Jamboard is almost all from your textbook. And then just don't forget at the bottom here, the mark allocation. I think it's out of 35. So it's quite a big piece of work. And you can either create a doc in Classroom and submit that if you do remember to include your name, or you can handwrite it as per usual and just send me a copy of your work. Just a reminder though, that is then due for Tuesday. So this is work for Monday and Tuesday. I've given you this video to watch, 2 other videos, the Jamboard and some reading. So I'm going to give you some extra time for that. I might also load the answer to the quizzes tomorrow as well, just add to it. All right, enjoy the week.